Let's do it. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to AROYA Office Hours Live. Whether you're an AROYA customer, AROYA curious, or just super passionate about growing and existing in this exciting industry, these weekly sessions are your chance to learn from the experts about crop steering, share cultivation tips and tricks, and network with other growers doing really cool things in this emerging industry. My name is Keisha. I'm going to be your moderator for today's discussion. Just some quick housekeeping before we get started. While we welcome lively conversation, AROYA Office Hours is not the forum for discussing cannabis policy, home cultivation, or complaints about the industry, no matter how valid those are. In order to keep these sessions useful to our community, we thank our attendees in advance for adhering to the following best practices. AROYA Office Hours isn't the time to ask things like, why isn't there an AROYA system for home growers? Are you hiring? Under the regulations in my state, am I legally allowed to insert activity? Or what does AROYA cost? Although if you like to book a demo, we would love to talk to you about that. However, AROYA Office Hours is the time to ask things like, what are some ways to go from manual growing to crop steering with hardware and software? De-leafing is the most challenging task our team has to deal with. Any tips on how to do this more efficiently? This is the data I'm seeing with my grow. Can you help me understand what it means? And what's the difference between water activity and moisture content? So now that that's out of the way, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat at any time. If your question's selected, we'll have you unmute yourself and ask away. So Scott and Seth, I think we have in the studio today. You ready for our first question from Instagram?
Yes, let's do this.
Awesome. Okay. Bad Habit wants to know, is it possible to effectively crop steer in 10-gallon pots?
Whew, that is a tough one. And I think 10-gallon pots would typically refer to outdoor growing. It's just a guess because I've never seen, maybe you have, Seth, people growing in 10-gallon pots indoors.
Not too much these days. It's become fairly uncommon as it's kind of backbreaking.
Okay. So, but I have gotten this question before. And I've even asked some experts in the field about it and got some different opinions. But what's your reaction to that? Possible to crop steer in a 10-gallon pot?
Well, when we're crop steering, a big thing we're looking at is controlling that dryback, right? And if our media is too big, it's going to be really difficult to actually control that. Mm-hmm. So if we've got a 10-gallon pot, I guess for reference, if you can grow a 6-foot plant out of a 1.5 to 2 gallon pot, how big does that plant need to be in a 10-gallon pot to get the same kind of control on your dryback? Because we'd rather have it drying back faster and be able to control it with more irrigation than only be able to get it about once a day and have, very little dryback.
Does it matter what the medium is that the grower is growing in?
There's differences in the media, but as far as pot size goes, not particularly.
Yeah. It's just a huge amount of volume to deal with. And the only suggestion that I heard that could be helpful here is to look at doing a multi-day dryback to feeding the plant on a daily basis, but minimally, and getting that dryback going over multiple days so you do get down to a point where either, if we are in natural soil where the water potential or in a soilless substrate in the poor water EC gets to the point where the plant is feeling some stress. Mm-hmm. And that is possible, I've heard, but that's more of an advanced technique, and I don't know how effective it's going to be. That's the only way I can think of to get at that.
Yeah, the best way I could describe it is you're going to be running generatively effectively the whole time because you have to space out your watering so far. It's going to be hard to push that really lush vegetative growth.
Right, yeah. So that's I don't know, Keisha, if that's useful, but one strategy is to do multi-day drybacks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then
that's
also
great. Always talking about strategy. Yeah.
I was going to say it's very important to get a sensor in there because on that 10-gallon pot, a person's ability to judge how heavy that pot is mixing it up is going to be way less accurate than with the smaller one even.
Yeah. And it's also, the other thing is on a pot that big, sometimes it's helpful to have more than one sensor and understand what the root zone really is and then what's going on at each level of the root zone. It's not as simple as just looking at a 3x6x36 slab or or a 1 gallon or 2 gallon cocoa bag. It's really a totally different mindset.
Great. I actually have a question. Speaking of pots, is a perfect segue. At Guwap Carlos, he wants to know, how do you use the Solus in plastic pots? Do you poke through them?
Yes. I was just at some customer sites last week, and by the way, had an amazing time learning about different types of indoor and greenhouse growing that some of our customers are doing. Visited 6 of them last week and really learned a lot. And I actually gave some bad advice to a customer on this, and Jason had to correct me. So actually, we'll do a little test, and because I told him to drill some holes in the pot and poke the Terros 12 through the holes, and then Jason kind of made this awkward face like he was embarrassed to be seen with me, and then told him to do something different. What do you know what he might have told me, Seth?
Typically, like or at least lately, the best results we've found is cutting a slot into the side of the pot with a knife, and we're kind of looking at maybe figuring out the best jig to use for that to make it perfect. But cutting a slot that's just wide enough to get all 3 of those probes in, and wide enough that you can seat all of them fully into the media, so you don't have that air gap.
Yeah, and that's it is a bit unwieldy to go with that round shape with the flat base of the Terros 12, but that was the advice that Jason gave as well. Cut something that will allow you to fully insert the Terros 12 into the medium, and don't just do it with a few holes. Mm-hmm. And it's important that the ends of the tines that are close to the base of the Terros 12, that they just not be hanging out in air, because then they're going to read the air instead of reading the substrate, and that's what we don't want.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, our next question comes from Bud Bros Inc. How many emitters per plant on rock wool, and does it matter for crop steering?
Yes, yeah, it absolutely does. And this goes back to the very fundamentals of something that in our quick start guide is called shot size. So you want to take it from the start, Seth?
Yeah. So with our emitter setup, what that's going to do is give us a lot more control on metering our shot size. Personally, my favorite is 2.3 gallon per hour per emitters per plant. That lets us put it on slow enough, but then we still have the volume that we don't have to run, 15 minutes to get enough water on there for an appropriate shot size.
Yeah, and that's what I almost always see is 2 emitters per plant. The pressure compensating emitters that not the kind of octobubbler setup. I mean, the octobubbler or ways of kind of distributing water over the top of the cube, it's kind of a practice I used to see more than I see these days. It's almost always pressure compensating emitters that are just the stakes and then going into the top of the plant. I think because of the differential in shot size that you would get on something that wasn't pressure compensated. Is that right?
Yeah, we have a lot more control with pressure compensating emitters, and we know that as long as we put enough pressure or the appropriate amount of pressure through that line, each one theoretically is going to put out the exact same amount.
Yeah.
And then we can also go, with some of the other ones. If we're looking at, flow rates of 1, 2, 3 gallons per hour, going down to that 0.3 is going to give us the control to put, shots down to 100 milliliters or less.
Yep.
When we're in veg steering, our 1% shot is actually pretty small. So it's really easy to overshoot it and just waste water.
Yeah. Yeah, and so control over the shot size is critical. And the way that you calculate that shot size is actually in the quick start guide that AROYA users get. So, that's one of the first things you do is calculate, well, what is my shot size? And then you have to understand that the medium that you're using, if you're in a 4x4x4 cube and you're vegging in it, that's going to give you a certain shot size. And if you put that on top of a slab, that's going to give you a different shot size. And then just doing those calculations correctly and being able to really know that those 2 emitters are going to give you exactly the volume of fertigation liquid that you need. Those are all key considerations.
Oh yeah, and then the other thing for me that I run into is testing those every run. go put some drip cups out and see how your emitters are performing, because unfortunately they do slowly plug up over time generally. And I haven't found a brand that's not susceptible to that after a certain period of time.
Okay.
And it makes sense. You're running a lot of salt, suspended solids through these things, and if you think about trying to design something that'll hold pressure but allow a small amount of something through, anything that's not fully dissolved in the solution is going to be problematic, right?
Yeah. I'm going to write that down because I want to take a look at whether the substrate data that we're seeing just from the Teros 12 sensor might give us an indication of whether the emitter is getting plugged. It might be something we can tease out of the data. We don't do that right now, but
you for sure can, because you can look at how much you're putting on. So if you say, like, I'm trying to go for an 8% shot right now, which is a big shot. But if I'm going to go for that, and then I look at the graph and wow, I'm only getting 2%, volumetric water content increase, but I'm nowhere near my runoff point.
Yeah,
that's telling me that my math's not adding up. The emitters are not putting out enough water.
Yep, exactly. That's a really good point. Let's see. And I did have that experience when I tried to do an experimental setup with a tent at home. With AROYA was that I set up a trash can that had a pump in it where I mixed up the fertigation solution to the EC that I wanted, and then I had an open sprinkler on there that would open a valve and turn the pump on, open the valve, water the plants, and then turn it off whenever I needed to have that happen. But in spite of the fact that I had some nice automation, I did not have a resilient system. And 1 week when I was on a business trip, all the emitters got plugged and the plants got super stressed. They didn't die because cannabis is kind of a resilient plant, but the quality definitely wasn't where I wanted it to be. So that was a learning experience.
Oh, yeah. Well, and we all rely on these systems. Once you've gone to automated irrigation, I mean, I've been in that situation before. You've got 1,500 plants in a room and your pump goes down. Well, suddenly, I'd love to fix the pump right now, but I got to go spend 3 hours watering these plants first, and you're really backed into a rough corner.
Yeah, and that is one thing we always ask people too if they say, "Hey, I'm interested in your AROYA system. What can it do for me?" One of the first questions we ask back is, "Do you have a reliable drip irrigation, automated drip irrigation system?" Because if you don't, and especially if you're hand watering plants, maybe AROYA is not the right fit for taking the next step. And we realize systems are expensive. Automation is expensive, but really the expensive thing in the long term is lack of uniformity and lack of control.
Mm-hmm.
That's a perfect segue into my next question from Instagram. And just a reminder to everybody who's on today's call, if you have any questions, please write them type them in the chat for a chance so we can get your question answered live. Speaking of uniformity, Big Thummy wants to know, how soon do you start feeding a drip? I found it easier to get uniform root by hand water.
I wonder, so say the question again, how soon do you start drip irrigation as opposed to hand watering? I mean, I know people who hand water in veg. I mean, it does happen, and I mean, it's just a question of how efficient you want the operation to be. So that is pretty common. I see hardly any customers. I don't know of a single customer of AROYA that hand waters in flower. But what's your experience?
Yeah, right now I don't think we have any. A few people have, bought the system while hand watering with the intention of building up their facility, and so we've got a little bit of data on that, and it's still useful. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to have that reliable system. And even in veg, anytime you're taking away visibility in the root zone and control, you're leaving something on the table.
Yep. Yeah. So I don't. I mean, there is a root-in phase as well that when you're not going to be watering at all, right? You're just you have the medium charged and ready to go, and you're putting those plants on. And you want those roots to come down, and I mean, in some cases, you'll go a day without watering. Is that true?
Sometimes, usually only a day though.
Okay.
For what we preach, I like to stake everything right there. Once I transplant over the table, stake it, you're done. You can walk away, and then you can watch your graph and see when you need to give that 1% bump.
Right.
around day 2, day 3, and start pushing a little bit of solution through there so we can get a lot of oxygen down in.
Yeah, that is a key consideration. It's actually one of the cardinal parameters for growing that we don't measure today, which is oxygen in the root zone. It's one of the 9 things that affects cannabis growth, and it's just something to keep in mind. That is maybe a little bit of a rabbit hole, but most of the customers I see try to agitate their fertigation solutions to maintain some level of oxygen in them. Is that a common practice?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want that to go stagnant and start growing. I mean, you've created quite the nutrient solution there. Many different things can grow in there, so you don't really want to have it warm and stagnant,
Yeah.
particularly. Yep. And, the nice thing about that, though, is you also don't have to put that much effort into keeping that oxygenated. Just like your fish tank at home, the bigger oxygenation for the root zone happens when that drop actually hits the pot, goes down into the media, and pulls air in behind it.
Okay, sure, yeah.
And that's actually one of the big advantages that going soilless or rock wool has over, say, deep water culture.
Oh, I see. So it maybe isn't so much that the agitation might just be for the uniformity of the fertigation solution, not so much for the oxygen.
Yeah, and that's where you see like Aeromitters and other circulation pumps.
Yep.
A lot of people will circulate their entire res every 15 to 30 minutes just to keep that fallout from happening on the bottom.
Yep.
And sometimes a lot of that stuff can be mitigated through proper mixing technique too. Sometimes that's the issue when you have some of those issues. So.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, Keisha, what else? What else?
Yeah. Ready for the next one. All right. Evil Go Seeds has a question. What is the minimum moisture content for a cube during dryback?
Well, this is a common concern that we try to address. And the first thing to say is that if you're using stone wool substrate, you will get channeling and hydrophobic properties emerging in that stone wool if you drop below 35%. So the absolute minimum for rock wool is 35%. I think that cocoa also has a kind of a minimum you'd never want to go under. Is that right, Seth?
Yeah, typically we call that about 20 to 25%.
Okay.
To stay on the safe side. And part of that's not so much that you're stressing the plant super hard, but you'll hit a point where, like Scott touched on, you'll, especially with the rock wool, develop those hydrophobic pockets. And even with the cocoa, you'll develop somewhat of the same thing where you find yourself going back with, say, a bucket of solution and putting that bag in there till it stops bubbling.
Yeah.
Just because it's running off the top. So you don't want to go too low. And, in all kinds of agriculture, water is actually one of your biggest crop limiting factors. So, when you if we look at your water content, and I can say, well, if we're calling 40 your bare minimum, that's an efficient bottom end. If you've spent 10 days total at 35 or 36 instead of up at 40 as your bottom, you actually might see, a quantifiable reduction in yield.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point.
Excellent. I've got another question here, and just a reminder to everybody who's on today, if you have any questions, type them in the chat. We'll get them answered live. Toddlevon wants to know, how do you get mediums to stack EC? Can't seem to get the hang of it.
Yeah. Well, okay, so this is something that does take experience, and the first time that I tried to do it, it was a lot more difficult than I anticipated for a couple of reasons. The first was that I didn't do a good job of actually charging the stone wool substrate that I was using. And so it wasn't in a good condition when I started to grow. And so I did get some root in, I did get plants that were growing, but I could never keep that water content in the range that I wanted it to even worry about what the EC was. And it was kind of frustrating. There was a ton of runoff and like I had all kinds of issues. The first point, it is difficult to do. The second point, the stacking comes from essentially the ability of the plant, and stacking is what we would refer to as the pattern in early flower, where the top EC that you hit gets higher and higher each time you dry back your substrate. And that happens because the plant's getting bigger. It's the water use each day is getting higher and higher, and then each time it pulls that water out, as it gets more effective at pulling that water out, it concentrates the salts in the substrate even more. Is that generally correct?
Yeah, that's a pretty good description. I think the only part you missed there is like when you're trying to stack EC, monitoring your runoff is a huge part of that. So, every morning in our P1s, we're bringing that up to peak saturation. And then, I notice a lot of people like in veg or in bulking are having trouble stacking EC. Well, in veg, that's where the sensors come in because you hit peak water content in the morning and then we'll go down, 3 to 5% and then back up maybe 2 or 3 and bounce right below that runoff line. So that way we're not rinsing any salt out of the bottom.
Right.
And that's the key, really. As long as you don't have the water run out of the bottom, that plant uses water and then it leaves salt behind in the substrate. And then beyond that, it's starting to tailor your nutrient regimen to figure out, okay, what EC do I need to be running in rock wool versus cocoa, which cocoa does have some cation exchange capacity. So when you're stacking in cocoa, sometimes that's a little easier than rock wool. If you're getting more runoff, that cocoa will hold on to that salt a little more. Whereas that rock wool, once you start getting runoff, you're going to really push salt right out the bottom.
So if a customer is struggling with this and, they have our system in place, so they do have visibility into what's going on in the root zone, do you think, how hard would it be to give them the advice that would allow them to start seeing success? Is that hard, Seth, do you think?
No, I don't think it's terribly hard. Like I said, the big thing is watching that runoff. And then what I find a lot of people do, when they're not getting the stacking results that they want, they're changing their feed EC.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily the safest or easiest way to go about it.
Right.
You're chasing something that you might not ever hit.
Yeah.
And just understanding, a little bit about those ionic interactions and how well your media actually holds onto that salt, and then realizing that, like in rock wool, there is no, bond to the media for that salt. It's just the water's gone, so the salt's still there.
Yeah. And I can say that the best growers, the ones that are hitting the highest yields at the highest quality that we work with, are feeding at a constant EC for their entire, the entire veg and flower phase. So
yeah, basically some of them will start off, right out of clone, more closer to that 2.0, but usually we like to hit about 3.0 all the way through flower. That's pretty easy to work with, but of course you're going to be adjusting, your nutrient ratios in there as you go through flower. You're going to be giving more micro boosters a little later, back off on your nitrogen, back off on your CalMag a little bit, but it is a lot easier to stack and monitor your EC when you have a constant feed, because you can start to predict what is that runoff going to do in the morning.
Yep.
I can see an expected drop in EC. It's repeatable every day, and now you can predict what's going to happen. Whereas if you just drop your EC, you got to wait to see after that watering how that affected the root zone.
Okay. Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Our next question comes from Space Dog Select. What's a good baseline ratio between potassium and calcium? What's on that?
The answer to that question is I have no idea. Any thoughts, Seth?
I think that's highly strain dependent.
Yep.
If you've got the ability to modulate that, for sure do it. And that's why using like CalMag products or calcium chloride products are really nice, because you have the choice to back that calcium off. Some plants are really calcium thirsty. Other strains, you don't really have to supplement much.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is evolving too as more and more, specific nutrient lines come out to address some of these problems. A lot of these amendments where we're working with non-cannabis specific fertilizers for so many years and finding ways to amend it. Now the market's kind of turning over to where we have a lot more tailored fertilizer product, and now we can just dial for each strain.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, what's the best way to note that in the journal? If you're making changes and you want to see what effect it has on a specific strain, how would you do that?
I would go take pictures of that strain.
Okay.
In note format and start looking at. At least that's what I have customers do. Like, hey, take a picture of your plant.
Yep.
And we've still got to look at plant health, look for any symptoms of either disease or deficiencies, and then go from there. And one of the best things you can actually do is get a leaf tissue analysis.
I see. Okay.
And then you can start strain to strain, looking at, okay, this one wants a lot more nitrogen, this one needs more calcium, and then do that tissue analysis a few times throughout your growth cycle, so you know at what points, like, okay, I can take a new leaf later on and start to see that, all right, this new growth is very calcium deficient, or very, phosphorus deficient, whatever, and then you can start to tailor your nutrient regimen to match your plant's needs throughout its cycle.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder, do you know of any tissue analysis labs? I mean, and I assume they have to be in the state where where you're growing. Do you ever get requests from customers about that?
I do, and yeah, it's highly state to state.
Okay.
There's state to state different places you can send it.
Are there some in California though?
There are. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. I'd have to go check some.
So we might have some references on that if people are.
Yeah, if people reach out with email, for sure.
It is something that some of the more sophisticated growers are doing, is that tissue analysis. And looking at big ag, this is kind of par for the course for a lot of crops. I know they do it a lot in potatoes, for example.
Potatoes, wheat. I mean, if you look at agronomic studies, that's like one of the core foundations of like trying to figure out, any improvement in fertilizer regimes. Like that's where you get your data on actually figuring out what the plant is deficient in. I can see spots on the plant or necrotic leaf edges, anything like that, and know that it means certain things.
Yep.
But quantifying what I have to do to fix it, I need that test.
Yep. Okay. So let's just really quick show in the software how you do that. So I'm going to go in here to our demo screen, and this is just a demo facility that we have set up. Seth's point about taking pictures is super easy. If you go and look at a harvest group that you have growing, so we'll just go into this harvest group we have here. These are all the plants that are in there. These are the 4 strains that exist. If we go anywhere on this chart, we can add a plus, and we can add a note. And if we do that, we can add a photo onto that, and that allows me to go in and select a photo from file and upload it to the journal entry here. And then once you do that, your photos are available in the analytics section of the tool, although there aren't any pictures in here right now for this one, but here's where they would be. And you can even just, in addition to adding pictures, you can take notes as well and say, well, this is what I'm seeing with this plant. I just upped the ratio of this type of element in the fertilizer today, for example. So you can do that.
Absolutely. And getting it, into AROYA or, the same place you keep all your other data is crucial, because I can definitely say I've got plenty of notebooks out there that have never been entered into a computer, and I'll look into it. There's some interesting stuff, but man, I don't have time to cross-reference piles and notebooks from 5-10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, there are lots of tools in here that are available and can be helpful to people as they grow. In fact, Keisha, do we have time to do a couple of tool tips? Because I think there's a few fun things here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. One of the ones that I absolutely love is the ability to, as you're making changes to the schedule, changes to tasks, changes to the alerts in here, or the length of the different phases, keep in mind that when you do this on a harvest group, you are changing this harvest group. You're changing the schedule. You're not changing the recipe. But if you find that this is really successful for these types of plants that you're going, you can go up here and save this entire thing as a recipe, which I think is brilliant. I think this is a great feature. Most people don't even know that it exists. But if you found that you had a ton of success and you just want to do it similarly next time, save that as a recipe and use it. What do you think, Seth? Do very many people know about this? Oh, yeah, a little bit. But a lot of times they'll use that same recipe for so long and never go back and change it. Yeah. And it's a wonderful tool. What I love to do too is, while you're going through any particular harvest or growth cycle, you've got that recipe, go in and make some changes based on, what you did different this time. So if you're looking at it and said, okay, we actually, this round, these particular plants we have are really stretchy. Okay, we're going to run that generative phase early on. Maybe even 4 or 5 weeks, because they're stretching like crazy. I want to mark that down. So every time I run these strains, I'm going to run, the tall recipe on those ones, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, exactly. And you can make that, that early flower. So let's say that these were the actual plants you were using and growing. You could add more tasks. You could create more targets. You could change the duration of the generative phase, for example. All of those things that would change your schedule in here. And if you saved it, it would also change the recipe. So it would update your recipe and allow you to improve it as you go along. Let's see, a couple other things that are top of mind. If I go back in here and we're just looking at the data for a particular range, and this is dummy data, so I wouldn't get too excited about it, but so we can see here's some plants drying back and some ECs. Notice a couple of things on here. First of all, these are displaying bench averages in terms of EC and water content. One tool that some people use and know exists. Let's see. Actually, it's not in here. How would I do a dryback? Is that available on this page?
Go to the room dashboard.
Okay.
And then right there.
Which one? This one?
Just let her load for a second.
That one right there?
Yep.
Okay.
Our internet's a little slow in Washington today, I think.
Yeah, we are having some internet issues. Yeah, that's not loading. Actually, let's do a different one first. Let's go in here and look at the harvest group again. You can do this in rooms as well. One of the really basic settings is that you can use for diagnostics is just looking at averages versus individual sensors. So if you go in here, you can say, actually, I want to show a room average. So that is the fat line that you see here. If you want to, you can also do individual readings, which for the individual sensors, which can be done in this way. And you see there's way more data points here, but each individual sensor with its serial number is on here. If you see an outlier that's really just way out there, super dry, for example, there probably is an issue with that particular plant, like maybe an emitter fell out. We've heard of that happening before.
Oh, yeah.
So you can go and look at this, look at the individual sensor data. And besides just, a emitter falling out or something like that, what might you use individual sensor data for, Seth?
So there's a few things I like to do. If I've got a pretty high sensor density in a room, what I do is when I'm assigning those, I actually, instead of the serial number, name the sensor with the geographic location. So when I'm looking at that, I can go, oh, there's an outlier. It's in zone 4 in the back.
That's a nice tip there.
But when you start looking at these, you can start to see some patterns. Like, if you've got a lot of airflow across the room, you're going to see those pots in the front drying down faster than the ones in the middle. The ones in the back might not ever dry down nearly as much. So you can start to parse out those differences and then work on, resolving issues with your microclimate.
Yep. Yeah, another thing that I like to look at when seeing the individual sensor data is the uniformity. Looking for anomalies and hotspots and things, but in general, how well are these? Is my drip system doing it, providing the same amount of water to all my plants at the same time? Oh, yeah. And if you see a huge range in here, you know that maybe there are issues with your drip system. If you see a really tight range, and this is, as I said, fake data, but if this were real data, you'd say these guys know exactly what they're doing because their other plants are doing the exact same thing at the same time. Then you can say, well, we do have uniformity, we do have predictability in our systems.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's see. I'm going to stop presenting. Okay, so what other questions do we have?
Yes. Oh, we have someone on the call who actually just posted a question. Jay, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask?
Sure. So we've been getting feed water testing, runoff water testing, and tissue testing. And we've noticed that certain cultivars, our runoff pH is getting high, like close to 7 or 6.8 in a lot of them. The tissue tests all look good. Is there any reason to be concerned or any improvements I can make? I dropped my feed pH going in to 5.5 down from 5.8.
Okay.
but I don't want to go any lower than that.
Yeah, I think you're right to be worried, but I don't think you should worry too much. Dropping your feed pH is about all you're going to be able to do about that. You could change the EC with your feed, but that's going to make things less predictable at the moment. So I would watch your plants and just look for signs of toxicity at first. And one of the bigger things that's going to be a problem there is that probably means that plant's pulling in a lot of your micros. So, being that you end up with a higher pH in the root zone, you might have to supplement certain nutrients more because they're not as plant available. They're staying in solution and not being uptaken by the plant.
Yeah.
So that's your biggest thing to watch out for. Yeah.
Any follow-up question on that, Jade? Is that sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that definitely answers my question. Unfortunately, I don't have zone specific feeds. I just feed to the whole room with the same nutrient solution, fertigation solution. So it might be a little tougher for me to resolve, but I think until I start seeing a real issue, I don't want to be hand watering specific zones or anything like that with different feeds.
For sure. And with micro supplements, a lot of times the range between what the plant needs and where it's toxic is incredibly wide. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times you can actually try to supplement what you're finding with your tissue analysis that some of those plants need without necessarily being toxic to the others. It's just running by them, essentially.
Is there anything you're observing in the plants that would concern you, or is it just the 7 pH in the runoff that is kind of an anomaly?
No, it's just the high runoff. They're actually some of the best looking plants in the room.
Yeah. At the end of the day, don't ever discount your eyes and your judgment of plant health. Like if you've been doing this a while, when a plant is healthy, vigorous, when it's growing good. Don't just discount that. The next step is finding out okay, that seems to be very tolerant of that pH, seems to like it. Maybe we can try to figure out why. But even if we can't, at least we can repeat that if that's what the plant likes, right?
Yeah. I think that's great.
Awesome, Jade. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, absolutely. If you have anything else, anytime, please type it in the chat. That goes for everyone else who's on the call today, but I do have another question from Instagram. Terp Cowboy is asking, how much light is too much? Can you run super high PPFD without sacrificing terps?
There's definitely an upper limit.
Okay.
Sure.
I think this is a fascinating question. So share your thoughts with us. I
was going to say there's a surprisingly high amount of light people are able to run these days that really impresses me. But no matter what, there is.
And what would you call that in terms of PPFD? What do you call high?
High? Oh yeah, when you're hitting 11, 1200, 1250.
Okay.
Some guys are pushing even up to 14, 1500. And that's probably about the limit of what I'd ever try to push.
Okay. Because of terps or because of yield?
Generally because of yield.
Really?
You're gonna get some bleaching, and then you're gonna have some other problems with trying to maintain your leaf surface temperature. You're really overloading the plants at a certain point.
And here we're talking about LEDs, or are we talking about HPS as well?
Generally LEDs, because with the HPS, the heat becomes very unmanageable. So
and you'll burn.
You got to keep the light so far away from the plant that it's really hard to actually achieve 14 or 1500 micromoles at your canopy.
Isn't it also dependent on the CO2 concentrations and what you're able to enrich?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
So because I saw a graph once that essentially showed that enrichment and light intensity, that the crop yields hit a maximum of, I think it was around maybe 1,000 or 1,100 ppfd with no CO2 enrichment. But then that maximum is quite a bit higher if you are carefully and accurately enriching with CO2. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. To think about it, that ambient air around us is anywhere from, depending on how close to a city you live or where you're at, 400 to 800 ppm. Mm-hmm. Well, if you can just run a straight 1200 the whole way through, you're eliminating another one of those yield limiting factors. The plant needs so much heat, so much water, so much CO2, and so much light to grow to its potential. So we just want to eliminate any shortcomings along the way.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, Keisha, what else do you have for
Ready
us?
for our next one? Yes. Leland Dowling is asking, what should my EC be at in my root zone and runoff compared to my feed EC?
Yeah, I mean that's going to depend on what your goals are, and so it's important to start off with a statement of intent. And this is something that data allows us to do. Is the grower says, well, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, and then using data to determine whether or not he or she is accomplishing that. I think that's the critical thing. But if he's talking about a certain phase of growth, I mean, let's just go with let's just say he's in bulking. Okay, so he's trying to bulk on the bud sites that exist on the plants after that early flower phase. So he's kind of mid-flower. What should he be expecting to see in terms of the in situ, the root zone EC, and then the runoff?
So root zone EC, throughout the day, your goal is to be within that 4 to 8 zone, but you can easily go up much higher just as the water dries back. And typically your runoff is just going to match basically what your root zone data says at your peak saturation, because what you're doing is just pushing nutrient solution straight through.
Yep. Well, so let's say, for example, that he's running kind of in the high range for vegetative bulking, and he's up in, like, say, the 7 range. And then his feed EC is 3, just for an example.
Yep.
If he goes and gets a lot of runoff, he can push that EC in situ down quite a bit, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, when we go to veg bulking, I mean, that's actually a challenge for some people, is to keep their EC up.
Yep.
Because they're not able to closely monitor and see when their different zones are getting runoff. So they might say, okay, well, this zone on my first P2, this one's not supposed to get runoff. But because of various different factors, it is. Well, now you're not going to be building EC. Each one of those P2s is just going to continue to rinse your salt out of the medium.
Yeah. And then you're too low.
Yep, absolutely.
And then you get into that range of being too low. So it really does depend on the phase of growth that you're in. What you should expect to see, and for example, in your P1s in generative, you're putting each of those shots in your P1, and eventually building up to the point that you're going to run off, right?
Correct.
And then once you run off, you're done. You stop, and then you just dry back for the remainder of the day. Is that true?
Yep. In an ideal world, when your plant size and media size is perfectly matched, you can do that.
Okay.
Even later, if you've got, and I've been in this situation before. You've got like a 1 gallon or a 1.5 gallon bag and a monster 6 or 8 foot plant coming out of it. It's hard to go generative because you got to keep putting water on it all day to keep it from just getting too dry.
Yeah.
So one of the solutions there would be, we're going to hit it with the P1s, and then right at the end of the day, we're going to still stop our waterings about 2 hours before lights off, but we'll hit it back with not all the way up to peak saturation, but if we had a really hard dry back last night and we hit, on Rockwell, let's say we got down to 35% or something, I'm going to give it like a 10, 12, well, probably 2 5% shots or a 10% shot towards the end of the day to bring it back up, to keep us in that safe zone, but still maintain that spacing. That way we apply generative stress.
Yeah. And I do want to go back to this concept of intent, of grower intent, because it's really hard to be consistently successful without that statement and saying, like, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what I want to do. So saying that you want to drive plants generative, for example, that's a statement of intent. And then looking at your situation, like what is my feed EC? Yep. What's my EC in situ? How big are my plants? What's the volume of my substrate? There are so many different permutations there. I know guys that are growing in states that are limited to plant count. Okay, so they're not limited on square footage. They're limited on the number of plants they can grow. They're trying to grow massive plants.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
That's the way that they can achieve more yield and be more profitable. And so their strategies are going to be different than the places where you're strictly growing according to square footage. Their plant densities are going to be different. The morphology, maybe even the types of light, but certainly the way that they're driving growth in those plants is going to be totally different. Is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially when you start to look at states that limit plant count. I mean, if I've got a given square footage, but I'm only allowed to grow 6 plants, say in a tent, well, ideally, if I had a 2 by 8 foot tent, for example, and I know this isn't really a huge commercial one, but if I'm in there, I want to stuff that thing full of plants and flip them small.
Yeah.
You know, get that fastest turnaround time.
Yep.
Well, if I'm limited to plant count for 6, I've got to change my whole idea of what I'm going to do.
Yeah, and that's why growers tend to be specialists at different types of growing.
Absolutely.
And we see people doing tiered growing, for example, where the strategy is to keep those plants small and get them through quick. You know, it's about velocity and getting plant counts through.
Absolutely.
And you know, it's using the building that they created a little bit more efficiently because they get 2 decks in the room. But you can't be growing 6-foot plants if you've only got if you've got 2 tiers and they only go up to 4 feet. It's just going to be a mess.
Well, and you know, a big thing I like to look at is real estate.
Yeah.
That plant, how much square footage is it taking up, and how long is it in your facility? So if you're not limited to plant count, well, 2-week veg, flip them small, higher plant density. That's the way you're going to get crops through faster, make more money. If you are plant limited, okay, well, if we're stuck with having to have a 4 or a 5-week veg to achieve the plant size we need, that's just what it is, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's why growing is so interesting, is there's so many different ways to approach it, and different strategies. But getting back to the original question, the feed EC, the substrate EC, and then the runoff EC, that'll just depend on the specific phase of growth that the plant is and what you're trying to accomplish. Is there anything in runoff? So we don't. AROYA doesn't have a system that just tests that runoff EC, and a lot of people are doing that manually and then just adding it to the journal. Is there anything that would is there anything in that runoff EC number is there a trend that might concern you if you saw it?
So we actually do have a product that can measure that, the ES2 now.
Oh yeah. Okay.
It's a plumbing issue there, so you got to plumb it into a trap.
You have to have it in a trap. That is true. But typically users are using that for feed EC, and that's a great tool for monitoring your feed EC, especially for something like a dosatron went out, okay, and then the room's not getting the right fertilizer. Just kind of a, hey, send me an alert when that happens. But yes, it's true. You can, if you put it in a trap, have the ES2 there. That's
exactly the first thing I look for in runoff. Actually, is like if you've got an injection system and then suddenly your runoff numbers are going super high.
Yeah.
Although your root zone AC may not be going super high because you're getting a lot of runoff, that would be a good indicator that your injector's not working and you're massively over fertilizing.
Yep.
Same thing with having an inline EC sensor in your feed. It's really nice to just have a monitor on both ends. So, tank mixing mistakes happen. Equipment fails, people fail.
Oh, even like sometimes I've heard horror stories about the supplier, drops fertilizer, the dry fertilizer for mixing, and it's mislabeled.
Yeah, that kind of stuff can happen.
It does happen. So you have to be careful.
Bad batches. It's all out there. It's still normal business.
Yeah. So it's good. That's especially on something as critical as fertilizer. It's good to have like a belt and suspenders type approach.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, Keisha. How about maybe one more? Yeah. What do you think?
Okay, this is a good one from Dutchman's Thumb. They want to know, what is the best way to reduce stretch with crop steering?
Apply generative stress. Get a little drought stress in there. Encourage the plant to pack on more bud sites and not stretch as much.
Yeah. And for anybody who, we just talked about that two-tiered growing. I've even seen 3 tiers out there. Be hard to maybe work in that facility and go up on ladders all day to do your plant pruning activities and stuff. But I have seen it, and and I've heard that really driving those plants generative will reduce the plant size. And also I've heard that I'm not a specialist on this, but that certain frequencies of light can affect morphology as well. Is that true?
Yeah. That's part of why we try to go for, traditionally, like the metal halide or the CMH for veg, and then your HPS for flower. Well, part of what we want to do is simulate, at the end of the year, the sun's coming through more of the atmosphere to hit us in the fall when it's ripening, so we get a little bit more of that far red. And that's going to help the plant ripen up. The plants are also adapted to that. They have different, what's the word? I want to say beta carotene, but that's not it. Several different molecules inside that target different wavelengths.
Okay, sure.
So like inside your chloroplast. So when we hit that far red, that's helping the plant make not just chlorophyll, but also different metabolites and build terpene production.
Yep. Yeah. So definitely what's happening in the root zone, your irrigation strategies can help you to intentionally control that plant morphology.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to say one other thing before we finish up, which is that I just pulled some plants into a tent. I even have some tomato plants, which technically I don't know anybody who's using AROYA on tomatoes right now besides Seth. Okay, so Seth.
Everything I grow.
Hopefully Seth can give me some pointers here. I just pulled him into the tent. I just dropped the little kind of seedlings into some cubes and started watering it, and I did do a much better job of getting the stonewall all saturated. I left them in the solution for a full day, and they're everything is going much better right now. Maybe next week we can actually drop some data on the screen and show what's happening. I'm having a little trouble getting the humidity as high as I want, but for anybody who's maybe struggling with keeping everything in their garden exactly where they want it, seeing my data will be a real shot in the arm for them because they'll see how bad I'm doing, and it'll serve as a motivation for them. So let's do that maybe next week.
Cool. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Seth and Scott. Great conversation. Thanks to everyone who submitted a question. All of you, thank you so much for joining us for AROYA office hours this week. This is your time. Any questions that you have about AROYA, how it can be used to help improve your cultivation and production process, or any topic that you'd like covered in a future office hour session, let's talk about it. Let us know in the chat. Shoot us an email at support.aroya@metergroup.com, or shoot us a DM via Instagram. We definitely want to hear from you. We record every session. We will email everyone a link to this session who came today, and it will also be on the AROYA YouTube channel. So please do like, subscribe, and share while you're there. And if you find these conversations helpful, share with your network and spread the word. And we will look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Keisha.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.